A quiet morning drive suddenly turned tense when blue and red lights flashed in the mirror. The hum of the tires on the road was replaced by the sharp sound of sirens. The woman behind the wheel took a deep breath and slowly pulled over to the side. Her heart stayed steady, but her guard was up. She had been in this position before, too many times in fact. Two officers stepped out of their car and began walking toward her. They looked confident, maybe even too confident, ready to show their authority. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't just another driver on her way into town. This woman was their new chief of police, and the moment they were about to face would change everything. Her name was Kendra Hayes. She had spent years working harder than anyone else around her, climbing through the ranks while facing barriers that could have broken her spirit. But she never let them. She had fought bias, she had fought doubt, and she had fought a system that often seemed designed to keep people like her out. Yet here she was, starting her first day as the chief of police in Cedar View. It should have been a day of pride and celebration, but instead her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. Cedar View wasn't just any town. It was a place known for its deep traditions, where the police department had carried a reputation for bias, especially toward minorities. Many of the officers had made it clear they weren't happy about her being chosen to lead. But Kendra wasn't one to back down. As the officers approached, she rolled down her window. The older one, broad-shouldered and stern, leaned in first. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, when he asked for her license and registration. Kendra moved calmly, reaching into her glove box and handing over the papers without a word. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the strongest response. The younger officer wasn't as quiet. He leaned in closer, his eyes sharp, asking why she was there, suggesting this area wasn't exactly safe. His words carried a weight of assumption, as if she didn't belong. Kendra's pulse remained steady. She simply told him she was on her way to work. But he pressed further, smirking, asking what kind of work. For a moment, she thought about ending it right there, revealing her role. But she decided to wait. She had nothing to prove to them in that moment. Instead, she met his gaze and answered calmly, "You'll find out soon enough." The younger officer frowned, clearly not used to someone holding their ground so firmly. The senior officer stepped in, his voice carrying a quiet threat. "Let's not make this difficult, ma'am. We can take this further if we need to." That was enough. Kendra had carried the weight of these encounters her whole life. She had endured the disrespect, the assumptions, the power games. But this was different. She wasn't just a woman behind the wheel anymore, she was their leader. She drew in a breath and said firmly, "That won't be necessary. I'm Chief Kendra Hayes, the new head of this department." The silence that followed was heavy. The senior officer froze, blinking as if he hadn't heard her right. The younger officer's smirk vanished, replaced with shock. Their authority slipped away in an instant. "You're the chief?" the senior one asked, his voice cracking. Kendra nodded, her tone unshaken. "Yes, and I'd like to know why exactly I was stopped. Why these questions were even asked." Neither officer had an answer. They stumbled, fumbled, trying to find an excuse. But the damage was done. Kendra stepped out of her car, standing tall in front of them. Her voice was calm but commanding. She told them they would be reporting to her directly, and that every stop they made would be reviewed. They muttered apologies, but Kendra wasn't fooled. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been made to feel small for no reason at all. Later that day, she stood before the entire department for her first meeting as chief. The tension in the room was thick. She recounted the morning's events in detail, not to embarrass but to send a message. "This kind of behavior stops now," she said firmly. "Every officer here will be held accountable for how they treat people. I will not tolerate bias. I will not tolerate disrespect. And I will not tolerate anyone who believes they are above the law." The room was quiet. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded with quiet agreement. Change would not come easily, but change had begun. Outside the department, word of what happened spread quickly. Some in the community saw hope, others saw a warning. But everyone understood one thing: Cedar View had a new kind of leader. Driving home that night, Kendra let herself breathe for the first time all day. She knew the battles ahead would be tough. She knew not everyone would welcome her leadership. But she also knew this was exactly why she was here: to stand tall, to lead with strength, and to make sure that no one else would ever have to face what she faced that morning. Kendra Hayes wasn't born into power or privilege. Her story was one of constant struggle, quiet strength, and determination that never gave up. From the time she was young, she understood the meaning of fighting for respect in a world that didn't always want to give it to her. She grew up in a neighborhood where sirens were more common than streetlights, where young people were often judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. But Kendra was different. She refused to be defined by her surroundings. As a teenager, she watched her community wrestle with injustice. She saw neighbors pulled over for no reason, families torn apart by unfair treatment, and kids her age grow up believing the system wasn't made for them. Those memories planted a seed inside her. She promised herself she would never stand on the sidelines. If change was going to come, someone had to step into the system and fight from the inside. That decision wasn't easy. When she applied for the police academy, whispers followed her. Some said she wouldn't make it. Others claimed she was only there because of her background, not her ability. But every time someone doubted her, Kendra worked harder. While others gave up during training, she pushed through. When long hours left her exhausted, she reminded herself of the bigger picture. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for every person who had ever been silenced. Years passed, and Kendra rose through the ranks slowly, steadily. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when she spoke, people listened. She learned to lead not by force, but by example. She earned the respect of those who doubted her, not because they suddenly believed in her, but because she gave them no choice. Her work spoke for itself. But still, the journey wasn't smooth. At every step, she faced barriers. She was often the only woman in the room, and sometimes the only person of color in her unit. Decisions that came easy for others always seemed harder for her. Promotions were delayed, recognition was rare. Yet, instead of becoming bitter, she grew sharper, stronger, more determined. She knew what she represented: hope for those who thought the system would never let them in. When the opportunity came for her to apply for the role of chief of police in Cedar View, she hesitated. The town's reputation was no secret. Stories of bias and abuse stretched back years. Many believed the department was beyond repair. But that was exactly why Kendra decided to take the risk. She didn't want an easy job. She wanted a job that mattered. Winning the position was nothing short of groundbreaking. For the first time, a woman, more than that, a black woman, was leading the Cedar View Police Department. To some, it was a moment of celebration. To others, it was a challenge they didn't want to accept. Inside the department, many officers were unsettled. Some openly questioned her leadership before she even started. She heard the whispers. She doesn't belong here. She won't last. She'll never change this place. But Kendra wasn't walking into Cedar View to be liked. She was walking in to make change. Her very presence sent a message. Times were different now. The system could no longer remain untouched. And while she knew the road would be rough, she also knew this was the reason she had worked so hard for so many years. On that morning drive into Cedar View, as the sun rose and lit up the road ahead, Kendra reflected on everything it had taken to get here. Every long night, every unfair judgment, every test of her patience had led to this. This was her day to step into the role she had earned with sweat and sacrifice. It was supposed to be a fresh start, the beginning of something bigger than herself. But as those flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror, a quiet thought slipped into her mind. Maybe this was a reminder that change doesn't come easy. Maybe the very fight she was about to lead had already begun before she even set foot inside the station, and deep down she knew she was ready. The flashing lights didn't just fill the rearview mirror, they seemed to fill the entire car. Kendra slowed her vehicle and carefully pulled onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. Her hands gripped the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, steady but tense. She knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary stop. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Behind her, the patrol car door swung open. Out stepped a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years on the job. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, the kind that said, "I'm in charge here." A younger officer followed close behind, his expression sharper, less patient, his eyes scanning her car like he was already looking for trouble. Kendra rolled down her window before they reached her. The cool air rushed in, carrying the weight of the moment. She met their eyes calmly, even as her pulse quickened. The senior officer leaned down just enough to peer inside. His voice was low and flat, carrying an edge of practiced authority. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just an order. Kendra moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into her glove compartment. Her years of experience taught her to never make sudden moves during a stop like this. She pulled out the documents and handed them over silently, her face neutral. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The senior officer's eyes lingered on her a little too long, narrowing as though he was trying to place her face. He didn't say anything, but his expression carried unspoken suspicion. The younger officer wasn't nearly as restrained. He leaned in closer, his tone casual but laced with something sharper. "What brings you out here?" he asked, almost as if he already knew the answer he wanted to hear. Kendra kept her voice calm. "I'm on my way to work." The younger officer raised a brow, smirking faintly. "And where exactly would that be? This isn't really the safest area for people like you." The words stung, not because they surprised her, but because she had heard them before. Different faces, different voices, but the same message: you don't belong. Still, she didn't let her composure slip. She looked directly at him and answered, her tone even. "You'll find out soon enough." That response seemed to unsettle him. His smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as if he wasn't used to someone turning his question back with such quiet confidence. The silence between them stretched for a moment. The senior officer cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice heavier this time. "Let's not make this difficult, ma'am. We can take this further if we need to." There it was, the subtle threat, the weight of authority being used not as a shield, but as a weapon. Kendra felt the old familiar ache in her chest, the one that came every time she was reminded how quickly respect could vanish when bias stepped in. But she didn't flinch. She sat tall in her seat, her eyes never leaving theirs. Inside, she wrestled with the choice. Should she reveal herself now and end this little game, or should she hold back? Let them dig their own hole, let their behavior expose exactly the problem she had come here to fix. She decided to wait. This was not just about her. This was a picture of everything wrong with the culture she was about to lead. She wanted them to see who she was after they showed who they were. The younger officer shifted impatiently, tapping the side of her car with his fingers, trying to rattle her. The senior one held on to her license longer than necessary, like he was testing how far he could push his authority. Neither of them had the faintest idea that the woman sitting quietly before them was the one they'd soon be reporting to. And as the silence stretched between them, Kendra knew something else too. This wasn't just a stop. This was the first real test of her leadership, and she wasn't about to fail. The longer the stop dragged on, the heavier the air felt around them. The early morning sun had risen higher, casting sharp beams of light across the windshield. But inside the car, everything felt cold and tense. Kendra sat still, her hands resting on her lap, while the two officers circled her like hawks. The younger one leaned a little closer toward her window, his smirk returning. "You know, this part of town isn't exactly safe. Not for someone like you. People usually don't drive through here alone. So tell me again, what exactly are you doing here?" His tone was not just curious, it was edged, pointed, almost daring her to give him a reason to doubt her. His eyes flickered with the kind of suspicion that came from assumption, not evidence. Kendra stayed calm. Her voice was level when she repeated, "I'm on my way to work," but her restraint only seemed to fuel him further. "Work?" he said, tilting his head as if he was trying to read her like a book. "What kind of work? You a nurse? Maybe a teacher? Don't tell me you're some kind of lawyer." His laugh was soft, but it wasn't kind, it was mocking. For a brief second, Kendra thought of telling him the truth right then, of cutting through his arrogance with a single sentence. "Chief of police." That would have wiped the smugness off his face in an instant. But she didn't. She reminded herself of why she had come to Cedarview in the first place, to change this culture from the inside. If she gave in too quickly, if she revealed her identity before they revealed theirs, she would lose the chance to show everyone exactly why change was needed. The senior officer, still holding her license, stepped forward again. His voice was firmer now, almost rehearsed. "Listen, ma'am. We can make this very easy or we can make this very hard. It's up to you. Just answer the questions directly." The way he said it wasn't just about procedure. It was a test, a flex of authority. A reminder that in this moment on this road, he thought he held all the power. Kendra felt her patience thinning. She wasn't intimidated, but she wasn't blind to the danger either. She had lived through too many moments like this not to know how quickly things could turn. A wrong word, a wrong move, and the situation could spiral. She breathed slowly, controlling every ounce of her reaction. The younger officer shifted his stance, arms crossed now, his tone sharper. You hesitated earlier. That tells me you've got something to hide. So why don't you just spit it out? His words hit the air like sparks, meant to provoke, meant to push her. But Kendra's gaze was steady. She didn't bite, didn't give him what he wanted. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her seat, her voice low but certain. I told you. You'll find out soon enough. That answer unsettled them more than an outburst would have. The younger one narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed that she wasn't cracking under pressure. The older one let out a slow sigh as though deciding whether to escalate further. Inside, Kendra's thoughts raced. She had been through worse, but this was different. This wasn't just about her being stopped. This was her first day as chief. This was the department she was about to lead. And here were two of its officers showing exactly the kind of behavior that had built Cedar View's reputation. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very reason she had been chosen for this role was playing out in real time, right on the side of the highway. She wasn't just living the problem, she was staring it straight in the face. The younger officer finally broke the silence again. You think you're clever, huh? Keeping secrets? Let me tell you, out here we don't play games. We call the shots. His words were sharp, but Kendra didn't flinch. She simply let his statement hang in the air, heavy with its own arrogance. Because deep down she knew something he didn't. In a matter of moments, the balance of power would shift completely, and while the officers thought they were tightening their grip, Kendra was quietly preparing to take it away from them altogether. The silence around the car had grown heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The senior officer still held her license in his hand, staring at it longer than necessary, his jaw tight. The younger one leaned closer, his tone sharp and impatient. You know, he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. People who hesitate usually have something to hide. So I'll ask one more time, what are you really doing here? Kendra's patience had reached its edge. She had been calm, respectful, and restrained. She had given them every chance to treat her with basic dignity, but instead they had chosen arrogance, intimidation, and veiled threats. She realized then that if she kept playing along, she wasn't just letting them disrespect her. She was letting them disrespect the very position she now held. Slowly, she drew in a deep breath. Her eyes locked on theirs, steady and unblinking. Then, with a voice firm enough to slice through the tension, she spoke. That won't be necessary, she said evenly. I'm Chief Kendra Hayes, the new head of this department. The words hit like a hammer. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. The senior officer froze, his eyes blinking rapidly as if his mind was struggling to process what he had just heard. His lips parted, but no words came out. The younger officer's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed shock. His posture shifted, his confidence draining out of him as fast as the color drained from his face. You're the chief? The older one finally stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Yes, Kendra replied, her tone unwavering, calm, but commanding. And I'd like to know why exactly I was stopped this morning, and why this line of questioning was even necessary. Her words cut sharper than any raised voice could. There was no anger in her tone, but the authority behind it was undeniable. She wasn't just another driver anymore. She was their leader, their superior, the one person in this town they could not afford to treat this way. The younger officer fumbled, his words tangled in his throat. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding, but Kendra didn't let him finish. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes firm. No, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is exactly the problem. You stop people like me without cause. You make assumptions. You lean on your authority because you think you can, and you do it because you don't expect accountability. The senior officer's face tightened. He opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it again. Deep down, he knew she was right. His silence spoke louder than any excuse he might have offered. The balance of power had shifted entirely. A moment ago, they thought they were in control. Now they stood on shaky ground, exposed, humbled. The uniform they wore no longer gave them the upper hand. It was the woman in the driver's seat who commanded the moment. Kendra let the silence linger, her words hanging in the air like a mirror they couldn't avoid. And in that mirror, the officers saw themselves clearly, saw their bias, their arrogance, and the humiliation of being confronted by the very person they had tried to belittle. Finally, Kendra opened her door and stepped out of the car. She stood tall on the roadside, the morning light catching her face, making her presence feel even larger. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm, unshakable composure was enough to strip away every ounce of false authority they thought they held. "You'll be reporting to me personally for the next few weeks," she told them, her voice steady. "I'll be reviewing every stop you make. And I suggest you think very carefully about how you handle yourselves from now on." The senior officer swallowed hard, his voice barely steady. "Chief, we didn't mean any disrespect. It won't happen again." Kendra nodded once, though she knew those words were empty. She had heard them before. It would happen again, maybe not with these two, but with others. That was why she was here. That was why she had taken this job, because this stop wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been pulled over, questioned, and judged unfairly. It was about a system that needed more than apologies, it needed change. And for the first time that morning, Kendra allowed herself to feel the weight of her new title. She wasn't just the chief by name. In this moment, she had become the symbol of something bigger. The two officers stood in silence, humbled, their authority dissolved. And as Kendra turned back toward her car, they knew nothing in Cedar View would ever be the same again. The roadside felt different now. Just moments ago, the two officers believed they were in control, holding all the power. But in an instant, that illusion shattered. Now they stood stiff and uneasy, stripped of the confidence that had carried them to her window. Kendra remained steady, her presence commanding without effort. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Her calm, collected tone carried more weight than any threat ever could. Authority wasn't something she had to force, it radiated from her. Because she had earned it. She stepped closer to them, not with aggression, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she belonged in this moment. Her eyes locked onto theirs, first the senior officer, then the younger one. Neither dared to hold her gaze for long. "You'll be reporting directly to me," she said firmly. "Every stop you make, every interaction you have, I'll be reviewing them. I suggest you think long and hard about how you carry yourselves from now on." The younger officer swallowed, his earlier smugness completely gone. He shifted on his feet, the weight of embarrassment pressing down on him. The senior officer cleared his throat, trying to regain a fragment of control, but his voice betrayed him when he finally spoke. We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. It won't happen again." Kendra studied him for a long moment. She could see through the words. They weren't spoken out of genuine understanding, but out of fear of consequences. And that was exactly the problem. Too often apologies only came when someone was caught, never before. "This isn't about what you meant," she replied evenly. "It's about what you did. And it's about the culture that allowed you to think this was acceptable." Her words cut deeper than anger ever could. They weren't just about two officers. They were about the entire department. About a system that had allowed arrogance to replace accountability. The younger officer lowered his gaze, his cheeks flushed with shame. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the badge on his chest didn't place him above responsibility. It bound him to it. Kendra took a step back, letting the silence linger, forcing them to sit in the weight of the moment. She didn't need to say more. The lesson wasn't in her words, it was in the shift they had just experienced. They thought they had the upper hand, but now they were standing before the very leader they had disrespected. She turned slightly, her voice softer now, but still steady. "This stop was about more than me. It's about every person who has ever been pulled over without reason, every driver who has been made to feel small, unsafe, or unwelcome on these roads. That ends now." Her words hung in the air, heavy but hopeful. She wasn't just speaking to them, she was speaking to the entire culture of Cedar View's police force. The senior officer gave a stiff nod, his pride wounded but his silence admitting more than his words ever could. The younger one mumbled something close to an apology, though his voice was barely audible. Neither of them looked like the men who had approached her car minutes earlier. Kendra finally returned to her vehicle, sliding back behind the wheel. But she didn't drive off right away. She took a moment to gather herself, to breathe, to feel the shift that had just happened. She hadn't just defended herself, she had set the tone for her leadership. Because leadership wasn't about sitting in an office or wearing a title. It was about standing firm in moments like this, when the easy choice would have been silence. As she started her car and pulled back onto the road, the officers stood watching, Their patrol car still parked awkwardly on the shoulder. They looked smaller now, not in size but in presence. And in their silence, Kendra could sense something shifting, not just in them but in the future of the department itself. For the first time that morning, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a turning point. A reminder that power doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from truth, responsibility, and the courage to stand tall when others expect you to shrink. The battle ahead would be long, and she knew these two weren't the only ones who needed to be held accountable. But this encounter was proof of one thing: change had already begun, and Kendra Hayes was ready to lead it. The day had barely begun, yet it already felt like Kendra had lived through a week's worth of battles. As she drove the final stretch into Cedar View, the reflection of the morning's encounter stayed with her. The flashing lights, the heavy stares, the smug words, all of it played back in her mind. But so did her own response, calm, firm, unwavering. She had faced two officers who saw her as just another driver, and she had left them standing in silence, reminded of what real leadership looked like. By the time she pulled into the station, the building looked different to her. Not because it had changed overnight, but because she had. The nervousness she felt that morning, the tight grip on the steering wheel, the unease in her chest was gone. She walked through the doors not as a stranger in a hostile place, but as the chief who had already taken her first stand. Later that afternoon, the department gathered for her first official meeting. The room was filled with officers, men and women in uniform, some curious, some doubtful, some openly skeptical. The tension was thick and every eye was on her. Kendra stood at the front of the room, her posture tall, her presence commanding without being loud. She didn't launch into a speech filled with promises or empty slogans. Instead, she told them the truth. She shared the story of her morning, the stop, the questions, the assumptions, the reveal. She didn't name the officers. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about reflection. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she began, her voice steady. "But I am here to make one thing clear. This kind of behavior ends today. Every person who lives in this community deserves respect. Every driver, every neighbor, every family. It doesn't matter their race, their background, or where they come from. From this day forward, accountability will not be optional. It will be expected." The room was silent. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Others leaned forward, listening more closely than they ever had before. A few nodded, quietly agreeing. She could already tell who would resist her leadership and who was ready to walk beside her. But that didn't scare her. She hadn't taken this job to win everyone's approval. She had taken it to bring change. Her words carried weight because they weren't just words, they were lived experience. The officers in the room could sense that. This wasn't a chief repeating a policy manual. This was a leader who had felt the sting of disrespect, who knew firsthand what injustice looked like, and who was determined to make sure it stopped here. Over the weeks that followed, word of her encounter spread beyond the walls of the station. Neighbors whispered about it in coffee shops. Families talked about it at dinner tables, and soon the story reached the local press. For some in Cedar View, it was the first time they felt hopeful about their police department. For others, it was a wake-up call. Either way, Kendra's presence had made an impact. She quickly became more than a chief. She became a symbol of change. Someone unafraid to call out the wrongs within her own department. Someone willing to carry the responsibility of rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy. Every day brought resistance, pushback, and challenges. But she welcomed them. Change was never meant to be easy. One evening, weeks later, as she sat in her office reviewing reports, she thought back to that first morning. The flashing lights, the smug questions, the disbelief on their faces when she told them who she was. In that moment, she realized something powerful. She hadn't just survived her first test, she had defined her leadership through it. Kendra knew the road ahead would be filled with battles, some visible, some hidden. She knew not everyone would support her, and not every officer would change. But she also knew something deeper. Her very presence had already broken barriers. Her voice had already sparked conversations. Her leadership had already begun to shift the culture. And as she closed the file on her desk, she allowed herself a small smile. The fight for justice was far from over. But she wasn't walking into it as an outsider anymore. She was the chief of Cedar View, and she was exactly where she was meant to be.